Well, I don't know the specifics of that case, but I've read little hints about it. The idea of taxing unrealized gains is just absurd.
Yeah.
Because what happened, if it's unrealized, you don't know what the gain is. And let's say I get taxed, I make 100% on a trade, or it's up 100%. But if I don't cash out on the trade, there's no gain. So how can you tax unrealized gains? What happens if I then pay tax on the gain and then the trade comes back and I only break even on the trade? Well, what happens to I've lost money on the tax? It's just nuts. The thing people don't realize about taxes is in order to work, they have to be practical. It's one of Adam Smith's golden rules. It's unfortunately one of the reasons that income tax works so well, because it's easy to collect. A tax on unrealized gains, and in fact, wealth taxes generally are very hard to collect because they're hard to prove and they get contested, whereas income taxes are deducted for the most part at source. So they're easy to collect. Same goes for sales taxes. That's why governments like them. 50% of government revenue around the world derives from income tax, and more in the first world. And for me, well, there's umpteen problems with our system of tax. First thing, we are taxed too much. Secondly, if you're a young person starting out in life, all you've got is your labor. And we tax labor relentlessly, and we tax it heavily. 45% in the UK, higher rate. And it just means that your chances of rising up the ladder are just cut off right at the head, right at the starting point, because you have half of your proceeds taken from you. Then you're paid in money that loses its purchasing power to inflation, 10, 12, whatever the rate is, percent a year. And that's another relentless tax. And then people wonder why there's such a gap between old and young. Income tax is built into income tax. It creates inequality. And so if Dominic Frisby was designing libertarian idyll, I like the idea of subscription taxes, which are voluntary taxes, where if you want the service, you pay for it. If you don't want the service, you don't have to pay for it. And people go, well, it wouldn't work. Well, it's worked in the past. The ancient Greeks had voluntary taxes. Liturgy worked for them. Pretty enlightened society, the ancient Greeks. And if you look through history, the most enlightened, the most innovative, the most inventive, the most brilliant societies have always been societies where taxes are low. Because tax is a measure of freedom. The less you tax somebody, the more economic freedom they have, the more of their own labor they own. And you can't have freedom without economic freedom. The two are closely intertwined. And the most heavily taxed society of all would be a slave society, because the slave doesn't own his own labor. He doesn't even own his own body. A totalitarian society, North Korea or something, the worker has no ownership of his own work. That's one extreme. And then the other extreme is Ancapistan, no taxes at all. And depending on who I'm hanging out with, I waver between classical liberal small state, 10% of GDP, a number that derives from the tithe, 10%. And by the way, it's a tithe 10% because we have 10 fingers on our hand. It's an easy number to calculate. And I waver between 10% and 0% total ANCAP, everything privately owned, subscription taxes, voluntary taxes, and all the rest of it. We probably haven't got the time to explain it here and now, but one of the things I argue for in that book is land value tax. But I argue for it at the expense of all other taxes. So you would pay no other tax apart from land value tax. And you wouldn't pay it on your house, you'd pay it on, or any improvements you make to your land, you'd pay it on the land itself, the rental value of the land itself. And that's the old Henry George idea. Right. Milton Friedman called it the least bad tax. I'm sure your listeners know all about it. And that kind of creates a voluntary society by accident. Some libertarians who I talk to hate it, but I quite like it. But it's a nice idea in theory, but we're never going to see it in practice because one, it's too difficult an idea to explain. And two, it's too difficult an idea to implement unless you have some kind of revolution. And three, what's most likely to happen is some kind of awful bastardization where we get land value tax in addition to other taxes instead of to replace other taxes, which is like worst of all worlds. But in any case, as a purist, idealist, I argue for it though I recognize as a realist that you're not going to see it as it was intended to be.
Okay, well, just to unpack that a little bit, is your thinking that, hey, other types of taxes that are in a sense penalizing socially desirable behavior, like a standard income tax, it's the more you work, you're getting penalized more. If you save, and then the dividends and interest are taxed, well, then that's penalizing savings and so on. Whereas if it's a pure land tax, like you're saying, so you don't want to tax the full value of the property with any buildings, because that discourages people from putting up a nice building and whatever. They get implicitly punished the more they create. But you're just saying the raw underlying, that geographical location, it's worth such and such. That's not so much due to human effort. And so you're not hurting incentives of what you want people to be doing by taxing that, given that you need a revenue source from something. That's
exactly what I'm saying. The unimproved value of the land. And your point is you don't want to tax behaviors that is good for society. Work is good for society, so we should not be taxing it.
Right.
You could argue that consumption is less good for society, and therefore maybe there's more of a case to argue to tax consumption than there is. Certainly it's less good than work if you have that sort of old school Protestant worldview, which I sort of do have. I mean, economists today are obsessed with getting people consuming more.
Right.
We will end up in a bad way. But in any case, you could argue that land hoarding is consumption and that land value tax is a consumption tax. But yeah, you should tax the land in its unimproved state. And it derives from a group of, I think they were French, 18th century philosophers called the physiocrats, or they were certainly European, Western European.
They were French, at least the beginning, they were French.
Okay. Yeah. And their idea was that nature gave us the land. The land isn't there because of anyone's endeavor and hard work. It was given to us by God or Mother Nature or whoever the primary power is. And therefore, it should be shared by all. If you do something to the land, you turn it into a farm, or you build a mine, or you build a house, or you build a factory or something, then you have improved it. And the value of the improvements should belong to the person who took the risk, or the person who since bought the endeavors of the person who took the risk. But the land itself was always there. And if you want exclusive rights to it, then you should pay a rent to the community that gives, and you want the government to protect your rights, then you pay a rent to have exclusive rights to this land. So that's the idea philosophically. And I like the idea that we all own the land. It goes back to the sort of nomads of the desert nomads, or the Kalahari tribesmen, or something like that. And we were originally nomadic once upon a time in the good old days.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey everybody, this is Bob Murphy. Thanks for listening to this clip from the In5 podcast. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing and share this video with others. We've got new episodes dropping every Friday with more insightful discussions. Stay tuned.